And we are live. How we doing, everybody? Welcome back to the Brandon Aceto Show. I'm here with Haz Al-Din, aka Infrared. Very excited to talk to him tonight. He identifies as what is it, a Leninist Marxist, right, Haz?
Marxist-Leninist is the
Marxist-Leninist.
official term. Yeah.
All right. So first and foremost, can you unpack that for me? Explain to the audience what that entails.
Sure. So after the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917, that was the culmination of a series of theories and methods developed by Lenin as a specific application of Marxism in the Russian context.
Mm-hmm.
And Lenin's contribution to Marxism was so unique and so unprecedented that Stalin decided to synthesize Lenin with Marx into a new and updated method, which he called Marxism-Leninism.
Okay. So what shaped your economic philosophy to convince you that school of thought was the way that an economy should be operated to reach its optimal state?
I don't think it was just an economic philosophy. It's also a political philosophy. But I guess what shaped it is an observance of communist states historically when I did the research independently and did it for myself. I realized there's this giant American empire or a global system, more or less, that has been imposed on the sovereign nations of the world, and in my opinion, which has come at the expense of our own sovereignty. And I had to study which countries and which movements were able to resist that and build alternative systems in the most effective way. And what I found with communist states is an ability to basically modernize and industrialize their economies from scratch without having to take on any loans from the international banking system, basically allowing themselves to develop in a way that's sovereign. So to me, the most important thing when it comes to economics is actually political. It's about sovereignty. Is your country going to be controlled by foreign and private interests, or is it going to be managed in such a way that serves the common interest?
Okay, so when you say you saw the most successful case studies in communist states, like so, what are you referring to when you say you saw an economy develop successfully with a communist setup?
Well, to paraphrase none other than Churchill, he talked about the experience in the Soviet Union where Stalin came to an almost completely agrarian country where they were using wooden plows and left it with nuclear weapons in a matter of 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, so the argument I would make with that is I know the economy developed pretty quickly under Stalin, but the Russian economy pre-revolution, it was kind of, in a peak phase that was like ready for rapid development because it was a very undeveloped, non-urbanized place, and it was like really broken up and not centralized. And he was able to create a centralized system where it's a very easy process to say like, all right, this is what we're going to do, let's do it. So with a young population, a lot of commodities, natural resources, I think they would have grown no matter what, and it just happened to be communism. And I think any type of organized system would have enabled that. So I'm really more of a free market guy, but I'm so respond to that, and then we'll dig into that.
Sure, I disagree with that because we can trace the origins of Russia's early industrialization efforts, let's say, to the late 19th century. And it was for decades this was happening before the revolution. And what we can observe from that is that it was all happening on the backs of foreign loans. So by the time of the revolution, not many people know this, but the Tsarist government was heavily indebted to foreign French banks because all of the industrialization that was happening, and it was very limited because of that inability to industrialize the countryside because of the social systems that existed there. The Stolypin reforms made an attempt to reform those, but they failed. It was all on the basis of debt. So I disagree that they would have done it regardless because they had a chance to do it for decades before the revolution and they couldn't.
Yeah, so when you mentioned debt, I agree that it's not optimal to have international loans that where other countries, kind of have you by the balls, so to say. But I do think that debt's necessary for economic growth because there's not all debt's equal. You have good debt and bad debt. Just like if you were to start a business, take out a loan, and it's going to pay itself off because you just need certain equipment or whatever to start making it profitable versus taking a credit card and going to the mall with it and just buying stuff that's not going to yield a return on that. So Are you making the argument that debt's not necessary for economic growth?
No, I actually agree with you that there are good forms of debt. An example I would use of that is the debt that the Chinese government takes out to build infrastructure, or any debt that's taken out for that matter, that's actually intended and meant to be paid back with more and with profit. That's productive debt, right? Productive credit. The
Hmm.
problem is usurious debt, interest bearing debt, which just accumulates on its own back on the basis of itself. And it's the beginning of money just from money itself, with no mediation by any investment in any kind of material or productive economy. I think that's really what's led to the loss of sovereignty for most of the nations in the world.
Yeah. So you're saying these high interest loans that kind of put people in a debt trap is more of the issue. So what you're more in favor of what private loans from a national standpoint rather than taking out international loans? Are you saying that would alleviate that problem?
I think that banking systems should be set up in such a way that they're A, both sovereign and accountable, and B, they're based in the lending out of productive credit and productive investments rather than the accumulation of passive rents in the form of interest bearing debts. And I think that many libertarian economists actually agree with this. The problem of rent was a problem even from the beginning of classical economics with Adam Smith and David Ricardo, which is the
Hmm.
question of, you have this class of people and this type of harmful economic activity where people will just sit on a monopoly, say land, that was the most prominent example, where all they're doing is just passively collecting rents without actually putting anything back into the economy to increase the total wealth. Now, if we look at how the economy has evolved since then, when they were just mainly talking about landowners, we can see that this rentier form of parasitic economic power has expanded to the whole sphere of the economy through the banking systems. And I think that's really the issue I have, I guess, with the system we have now.
Yeah. So when you say you have a problem with people creating housing for rent's sake, I would say that, but like there'd be less housing that existed if those people weren't creating that housing in the first place. And the housing is one of the essential needs of any person. So how's housing supposed to be created if there's not an incentive to receive money for the housing that you create?
I don't think it's necessarily the fact that there's housing markets at all that's right now a problem in the world. I think, to paraphrase Xi Jinping, houses are for the purpose of living in. So whether that's houses are being created for a for-profit basis or otherwise isn't really the problem. The problem is that a lot of the housing and real estate that exists is being gobbled up by, say, BlackRock or Vanguard just for the purpose of speculation and sitting on it. And in any other sphere of the economy, we call that scalping. But in this case, it seems to be treated as a legitimate form of economic activity. But I think it's harmful. I think that, however, housing should be provided for the people, houses are for people to live in, not just to collect, passive rent in terms of speculation.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree that the BlackRock aspect of that's a big problem. And so the direction I guess I want to go in is, what do you think is like the optimal way for a government for a economy to be run? Because from what I understand, you're in favor of lots of government intervention in the economy, and I don't think that America's exercising capitalism the way that it was sold right now. I'm more of a free market person, and I think that a free market is the most beautiful, optimal thing you could have, and that it should not be interfered with, or should be interfered with as little as possible. Because anytime I've seen a government intervene with the economy, it leads to disastrous results. Would you agree with that?
I think a free market is a good ideal. I just think that in reality, we should look at how actual historical free markets have evolved. And they evolved in the direction of the rise of monopolies, which is what has led to the loss of economic sovereignty and the rigging of the economy in favor of private interests that we've seen now, and the loss of a free market, which I'm sure you would agree with happened. I think that an absolute free market is not possible, but to have the fairest market, the freest market, where there's the most amount of opportunity and the most amount of competition, I do think you need heavy handed government intervention. Do I trust the government that we have now? Absolutely not, because it's occupied by banks. But if we had a government that was actually sovereign, that was based in popular sovereignty, then I think that heavy handed government intervention is a very important prerequisite to both economic prosperity and sovereignty. I think the government should be responsible for the monetary system. The centralization of credit should be in the hands of a political authority, not a private cartel of banks, as in the
Oof.
case of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, see, I definitely disagree with, because I think that the government's the reason that we lost the free market and the reason that monopolies were established. I mean, think about Standard Oil, for example. So, you know, naturally, the first one into an industry is going to be able to offer the cheapest price because they get a head start and everything, So they're going to be able to undersell all their competitors, drive them out of business inevitably. But what gets rid of that is not government intervention, but innovation that disrupts that industry. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of the 1951 Invention Secrecy Act, but that's a prime example of the government getting in the way of something that will decimate the oil industry. So what do you think creates that? Like, lobbying to the government creates that, and the government protects these big monopolies. So, I blame the government wholeheartedly for the erosion of our free market that we should have.
I don't think government is the problem. I think we have to look at the actors who were using our government and occupying it basically by buying it out in the first place. And if we look at the rise of Standard Oil, it's a great example. If we look at the rise of JP Morgan, and the railroad monopolies, that was some of the first ones that we saw. We saw a process that was before the need to have the government rig the economy for these special interests, a way of rigging the market and destroying competition by simply destroying but through buying out all of the competition. And you had this marriage between the banking system and these industrial monopolists, which guaranteed them an ability to basically prevent the possibility that innovations, which would cheapen costs of production, would challenge their foothold on the market. And I think one of the only things that could actually bypass that tendency that arises from markets is innovation that's rolled out by the government and imposed upon the economy by government, so that it can't be bought out, so that there's no way to use the logic of markets to stifle progress.
But the government's not innovative, though. They that's why they contract things out to the private sector. Like, what has the government ever done that's a better product than the private sector? That's why, the Federal Reserve will have BlackRock help them assess its books when a financial crisis happens, or that's why the Department of Defense, contracts Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. Which, by the way, that's another major problem with our country, is the fact that all these big industries like banks, military industrial complex, pharma, they've all consolidated into these big 5 or 6 players, and that's because of government assistance.
Well, I think it's a matter of the cart before the horse. I think on the topic of innovation, I think historically governments, through R&D research that was taken out as a form of credit, but not necessarily for the purpose of profit, has been a huge, if not the most significant driving force of innovation across history. The internet, as we know it, would have not been possible without the kind of research by ARPANET, I believe it was, by the Department of Defense. And I think what the private sector does is it takes these innovations that the government creates and it optimizes them. It makes them more consumer friendly. It uses them in very creative ways, and I wouldn't discount that at all. But I think that the role in terms of forcing a wedge into the economy to force it to adopt innovation, I think that's a role primarily played by government historically. Now, regarding the monopolies that you're talking about, it's important to understand that these monopolies preceded the occupation of the government that we have now, meaning first the market gave rise to these monopolies, and only after that were they able to basically bribe the government to do their bidding. So we have to ask the question, maybe I would ask you if I would be able to, in a free market, how would that be prevented?
From the private market bribing the government?
From private interests.
Well,
Monopolists.
I'm totally against lobbying, and that's what you're talking about. You're talking about lobbying. So, it's on paper, it's illegal for industries or companies to directly bribe government officials, but it's very much legal for lobbyists to do that. So I'm completely against the concept of lobbying. I think that's one of the most destructive forces in our country.
Well, as a Marxist, I think the way I would look at it, and maybe this is the disagreement, is that we have to look at, on paper, we can have laws, we can pass laws, we can have things in constitutions and written documents, and that's all well and fine. But at the end of the day, what's actually going to drive the decision making at the reins of power? What's actually going to decide policy? because we did have a constitution. The constitution expressly forbids actually the formation of things like the Federal Reserve. So we already had that. So why is it that even though we passed laws on the books that were meant to prevent this kind of corruption, that it was nonetheless able to happen? And I think from my perspective, it's because the material economy, the material site of production of how things are actually made, how we actually survive, is all whatever powers that are going to arise at that level is going to affect sovereignty however they want to. And it doesn't matter what laws we pass. It doesn't matter how much we campaign against lobbying. As long as there's a material incentive to bribe the government, as long as the people who control the finances, who control the natural resources, who control the industries and the infrastructure, they can basically fashion and decide policy and the laws however they see fit. And I think that's I think that's why I find Marxism to be as persuasive as it is, because it shows us the importance, as far as political sovereignty is concerned, of the economy.
But so you say that the biggest problem is that businesses are able to manipulate the government, but so putting the power completely in the government's hands, which Marxism would do, how is that a better result than having at least some degree of separation between business and government? You won't put all in the hands of government. I don't see how that plays out in a better situation.
I think recognizing that the economy, to at least some extent, is a sphere of sovereignty, that is a domain over which political sovereignty has relevance, that it's not just something totally separate, is a very important square one to being able to make sure that governments can't so easily be corrupted and bought out by these private interests. Now, would that give governments more power than they have now? Well, it's a little misleading, because it clearly couldn't be the same government we have now, because the one we have now is occupied. So this would have to be a government infused with a new form of popular sovereignty and accountability to the people. But the people still have a responsibility to actively participate in political life to keep their government in check, as our founding fathers intended. But that's the price that comes with having collective responsibility. There's no government that's just going to passively do everything we want it to without our participation. In order to become a sovereign country, we need to take responsibility for our country. We need to be actively involved in making sure that government policy fulfills the aims of the common interest. And what I can observe from countries like China and even Russia that I know is that those governments, however imperfect, seem to be more responsive to the feelings, the needs, and the sentiments of their populations than
Come
ours
on.
are.
Come on, man. The thing about COVID, for example, we saw firsthand people locked in their houses in China with the doors welded shut. The building was on fire, and that's why there was a protest in China, because of how harsh and brutal they were with their restrictions. And our government, at least, like, they were crazy at first, but they started to back off a bit after the people were really upset about it. And then Russia, you think the vast majority of Russians want to be involved in this war right now?
I do, actually, but on the topic of China, I would say that in the beginning, the measures taken by the Chinese government were overwhelmingly popular among the population. And I think what you describe is the opposite in terms of comparing it to America, because at the slightest hint of protest in China over the COVID measures, they were suddenly lifted.
Yeah, but they
And
also assault people when they're protesting too.
I can't really. I mean, if you're referring to the Tiananmen incident in 1989, we can kind of get into that. But beyond that, I don't really.
Shanghai, where they were spraying the ink on people to be able to find who was protesting.
Are you referring to Hong Kong or
Or that's
what?
what I mean. Yeah, Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Hong Kong is that those were riots, and
Thin,
riots which got violent.
thin
And
line between the two, though.
sure, that's true, but there's a certain minimum of maintaining peaceful protest and making sure that doesn't devolve into total civil unrest with the destruction and carnage that causes. But I should also add that Hong Kong is administrated separately from the mainland, meaning their police forces and their government obeys laws and systems which are only in the last instance answerable to the mainland. So, for example, foreign countries can't set up military bases in Hong Kong, But as far as the laws that they have in Hong Kong to crack down on civil unrest and things of that nature, that's not decided by the mainland. That's decided by the government there.
Yeah, but there's hundreds of journalists and government officials that disappear all of a sudden. Or look at Jack Ma. Jack Ma spoke out against the Chinese government slightly, and now he's like a substitute teacher. That'd be the equivalent of if Elon Musk was suddenly just erased from his industry and like banished into nothingness because he spoke out against the government. I mean, that's a indication of how powerful the Chinese government is and how much they are against, somebody speaking out too much against them.
I don't think that was the sole reason why there was trouble in the case of Jack Ma. But to put it into perspective, it seems like from just analyzing that situation, what a drastic difference between our governments is. Where here, the elite class totally has our government bought out and our government does everything they say. It's actually quite remarkable how in China, even if you are one of the richest people in China who has the most amount of money, you cannot infringe upon the sovereignty of the state at all. You can't even put a dent in it. You'd think Jack Ma, with the billions that he has, would be able to somehow circumvent the rule of law, whether you agree with that rule of law or not, but he can't. And I think that's something remarkable and maybe something to learn from. How is it that they're able to maintain a rule of law and a form of sovereignty that is applied equally to everyone, regardless of their wealth?
I would say with brute force, but so I mean, yeah, obviously the two decisions are: do you want businesses to be more powerful, or do you want government to be more powerful? And I'm more scared of the people with military and that run jail cells to be the ones that are more powerful, because if they start to dislike what you're saying, they could use the law against you, they could use military and police force against you. The other ones, what are they going to do? They're going to lobby for legislation or hike their prices. I mean, there's a limited amount of damage that business could do to you versus what a government could do to you if they don't like what you're saying.
I actually disagree. I think that from the very onset in which the United States government started using police and military force against its own citizens, that was because they got bought out by these cartels and by these monopolists. And the rise of the CIA, the rise of the DHS and the FBI and all these unconstitutional federal agencies, which do infringe upon the ATF, which do infringe upon the rights of citizens, these things emerged and grew as powerful that they did at the behest of the Rockefellers and the Morgans and all these other kinds of elite families who, circumventing our Constitution and circumventing the republic that we had on the books, were able to enforce their will through the military-industrial complex, through the agencies I just described, in a way that is totally outside the form of our popular sovereignty. So I think that can be firmly blamed on big business, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, the military-industrial complex is a good example. That's a result of the government cutting spending after the Cold War. We went from having 200 defense contractors to 5, and it's much easier to sway policy and lobby for war when you have 5 giant ones versus 200 medium-sized ones. And on the topic of businesses encouraging government to come down hard on the citizens, I mean, yes, I'm totally against what the Patriot Act did. It's disgusting. There's a lot of things that I dislike about the CIA, but I mean, it's a lot less brute force than an overt than what other countries are, like Russia and China, are doing. At least, they can't be incredibly over about it and go into your home and, drag you out without any constitutional rights. I mean, that's a much scarier proposition than you being spied on.
I think the difference is precisely what you mentioned, whether it's overt or not. It does happen here. I would argue it happens with the same degree of intensity, if not a worse degree of intensity, because let's remember, we have the highest per capita prison rate on planet Earth, higher than
Mhm.
China, higher than Russia, higher than any country we know about. So the prison system and the punitive system we have here is very harsh. And as far as if you can get dragged out of your home, I mean, this is precisely what the FBI just did recently to the Uhuru group, just because they were sharing memes on Facebook and talking to people that they didn't like. Likewise, we see in the case of the January 6th protesters, some of them are still behind bars to this day for doing almost nothing. So we shouldn't really make any mistake. We live in an extremely authoritarian country. The difference is that it's disguised in a way where that authoritarianism isn't accountable to us. They don't have to give us a reason. They don't have to give us an explanation. They just do it and then lie and pretend that we're somehow more democratic and more civilized than others.
No, but there's recourse here, though. I mean, I totally agree about the prison system. It's that's one of the more disgusting things. How the prison association will lobby to keep certain laws as certain crimes so that people could keep going to jail for marijuana offenses. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with the fact that it's profitable to send people to prison. That's one of the disgusting things about America. But strong but I mean there's much more recourse in America if somebody was to overstep your constitutional rights or overstep your legal rights. We have laws and courts which are also, yes, flawed, as we saw last week, but there's much more layers in between us and the government overreach than in other countries. So I mean, on the topic of overreach, one thing I wanted to ask is, how do you defend the fact that 100 million people died between Stalin's Russia and Mao's China?
I would deny that figure entirely. I think the authors of that figure, who wrote the Black Book of Communism, some of them, I think two out of three of the ones who came up with that figure themselves admitted that the original author was just obsessed with tallying up and reaching 100 million just because it would sound as dramatic and as big as it did. But the truth is, the death toll as a result of famines under communist states is nowhere near that, and the death toll as a result of repressions is just minuscule in comparison to the total amount of deaths that of people who died through persecution and wars and so on in the 20th century in general. For example, if you tally up all of the so-called victims of capitalism, if we're using the same logic in the 20th century, we get a figure of approximately, and I could be off the mark just by a little, of 264 million people dying. That's including the famines and the starvation and so on and so on. So even if it was true that communism killed 100 people, which it didn't, it would still be less than half of the victims of capitalism.
So where do you get that number from? Because I mean, if you're just making the case that a few people said it's not true, but then there's lots of cases of not just people trying to spin a narrative, but firsthand people. Like, I mean, I don't know if you've read the Gulag archipelago, but that's somebody who is there firsthand experience, seeing the firing squad, seeing the famine. Right. I mean, why were the shelves empty at all these Russian grocery stores? Why are they having bread lines? Why is there
I think here we're touching on multiple topics. As far as the ability to prove these things, I just encourage everyone to do their own independent research. I probably can't provide the research right now on the spot because my hands are tied, as we can see. But do your own research. And I think if you do it thoroughly and if you investigate hard enough, you'll find that what I'm saying is correct. Regarding Solzhenitsyn, you're right that he claimed to be writing his memoirs on the basis of eyewitness testimony. But there's a few things. One, he's just one witness. Why isn't his testimony replicated by all the other people who went through the Gulag system, or even a significant minority of the people who went through that system? Two, Solzhenitsyn himself said that much of what he wrote was fiction. It was a form of literature. It was more to embellish and to kind of develop what he viewed as the existential and spiritual damage communism did. So he himself admits that there's many things he writes about that aren't even based in his experiences or fact at all. If you read what he actually says, that it's a form of literature, it's a form of fiction in many ways. You're supposed to believe that there's a huge amount of truth here and that this is reflecting real facts. And I'm sure there are grains of truth, but these Gulag archipelago is not a legitimate, from a perspective of historical research, documentation of what a person would experience under the Gulag systems. Finally, regarding the empty shelves in the Soviet Union, it should be remembered that these images of empty stores and shelves in the socialist bloc in the Soviet Union that shocked Western audiences, these came in the late 80s at the high point of crisis, just around the time in which those systems were dissolving, were going under their total collapse. Yeah, it's not very fairly representative of what the norm was for Soviet citizens in the post-war period, I don't think.
Yeah, but you have two instances of the government running the agriculture industry in China and in Russia. And, the fact that they tried to centralize that and it went horribly wrong at one point, I think that's a clear indicator of the government mismanaging something that they're trying to control. So would you rather have a centralized government running one industry, or thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual people doing it on a small scale with their individual farms? I mean, one has a lot more room for error if it goes badly. Because I mean, have you heard of the experiment they tried to do where they tried to dig like the crops a few feet deeper, and then it went wrong and they lost a whole crop because of it?
Well, just to respond generally to that point, I think that there were mistakes committed in the transition into the modernization of agriculture in both Soviet and Chinese experiences. But let's remember what was at stake. What was at stake wasn't them promising a utopia and then at such a human cost. What was at stake was defending their political sovereignty. Stalin said in 1931, we have 10 years to develop. No
Hmm.
more than that. And if we don't, they're going to bury us. Because remember, after Russia's revolution, the whole world invaded Russia. And it came at great cost. It was very harsh. I'm not saying it was all flowers and roses. The price of sovereignty, the price of national sovereignty and freedom is very high. It was also high in the American Revolution, where many lost their lives fighting the British, but I digress. In the end, their goals were accomplished. They modernized their agriculture. Their extra yields from and their surpluses of grain were able to finance probably one of the most rapid example, the most rapid example of industrialization in the history of mankind, save only for Japan, and that was off of the back of Western loans, a privilege the Soviets didn't have.
Or you could argue them shifting to democracy and capitalism.
I'm talking about Japan during the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, like post World War II.
No, before World
Oh,
War II.
before World War II.
Yeah.
Okay. Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, if it was going so great though, why was it? Like, why did they need to keep people in like as if it was a jail cell? I mean, it was called the Iron Curtain. Whereas America's broadcasting itself nationally and putting itself in magazines on TV. Whereas Russia, you don't know anything, or Soviet Union, you don't know anything about it. China today, you hardly know anything about it. I mean, North Korea, it's like a prison state where people aren't allowed to leave. So why do these places who tend to be communist feel the need to entrap their people and prevent them from leaving if it's so desirable?
Firstly, I don't think that China is trapping or Russia is trapping their people. I don't even necessarily think that's true in the case of North Korea, although I will agree that North Korea is much more enclosed and secretive than the previous two countries I mentioned. But regardless, the reason these societies are not open, quote unquote, is because they are protecting their sovereignty. They're protecting attempts by the CIA and by the military industrial complex and by the ruling classes centered in the Wall Street and City of London international banking system from totally destroying their societies, from totally subverting them, from inciting and causing panic and confusion on a mass scale. Could people access Western literature? Absolutely. Could they access Western media? Absolutely. If you knew where to get it, anyone could, right? Even in North Korea today, North Koreans have access to Western media.
No,
But
no, they don't. People who escaped there said it's this horrific place. I mean, we had Naomi Park on one of our shows with our founder here, and she's explained the horrors of it, and it was by the grace of God that she was able to escape.
well, I don't want to be unfair because she isn't here, but if she was here, I would tell her to her face that she's a liar and she's a
Come
proven
on,
liar. She
what are
is.
you
I mean,
talking about?
it's not very it's not very pleasant to have to point this out, but she's a proven liar. Many have proven that her stories are wildly inconsistent. They have no basis in fact. They're not replicated by the testimonies of any other witnesses. They
Because
don't
they're
even
all
make
locked up
any.
there.
Sorry?
Because they're all locked up there. How's there going to be other witnesses when you risking your life trying to leave the place?
I think it's a little ridiculous to assume that Yeonmi Park is the only person who has left North Korea.
No, I'm not assuming that, but I'm sure a lot of people who do escape don't try to, get in the limelight after doing it because they're still at risk.
On the contrary, there is a huge material incentive for them to tell these kinds of stories because once they leave North Korea, they lose all of the benefits they used to have. They lose the family and social connections they had before. They're totally stranded and left on their own. Many of them are trafficked into sex trafficking and other kinds of forms of slavery in the South. But for those that aren't, it's really hard to make a living on their own. So, one of the ways in which there's a material incentive to make a living is to go famous and viral, basically telling wild and sensational stories about a country that is very secretive and which Western audiences remain fascinated by. I mean, there's a demand to know about exactly what's going on in North Korea. There's a sensationalism to it. And Yeonmi Park, I think, is the epitome of the kind of industry that has been built off of feeding that demand, but in a way that is just so at odds with just any kind of common sense reality. It's not even plausible logically if you think about it. North Korea, or any other state for that matter, no state in the world can survive just on the basis of pure force. I mean, that's a state of warfare. If it's just in a state of pure force, that implies there's a contestation going on. Human beings are not cattle. Human beings.
But that's why their GDP is so low. I mean, North Korea and South Korea is the most perfect case study of what happens under, Western culture versus Soviet Union culture. I mean, Soviet Union took North Korea, U.S. took South Korea, and they adopted their culture. Look at the two. So South Korea's got $1.6 trillion GDP. North Korea's got $48 trillion GDP. You look at one of those things with the electricity grids. It's one of the darkest places on earth.
That's actually. I recommend you look at real photos of the electricity in the North and South. It's just kind of a meme. But I grant your point. South Korea is much more developed and advanced than the North right now. But let's add some context here. For the better part of the post-war 20th century in which both states existed, North Korea actually had a better living standard than the South. It wasn't until the 1970s where the South, the fruits of the Marshall Plan really started kicking in, that the South experienced the kind of super industrialization it did because it had access to the entire international world market, including the United States. North Korea can't sell its products to the United States. As a matter of fact, they can't sell their products to anyone nor import products because they're sanctioned. So they don't have the advantage of having any access to international trade or the international market. And after the Soviet Union dissolves, North Korea, that's when, everyone says they're always starving over there. Well, they actually did experience a famine, and that's the famine they're famous for having because they lost any amount of the economic interconnectivity and foreign trade that they had, however limited it was. The socialist bloc is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. North Korea was quite literally on its own. Even its ability to trade with China is so very limited because China's ability to trade with the U.S. is conditional on the fact that China has to observe our sanctions that we impose on the North. And I'd ask the following question.
Mm-hmm.
If the North's system is so fundamentally worse than the South's, and if it's so much worse in all of these ways, why do we find it necessary to prevent them from having an opportunity to trade with the world? Why do we sanction them? Why do we contain them? Why do we harm them and try to overthrow their government? Why can't we just leave them alone and see how things will go?
Well, I mean, because they've been hostile to us and, threatening us with nuclear weapons for the past decade, for one.
But which came first? Because I think the nuclear weapons came only after we adopted such a hostile and belligerent stance to the point where we don't even recognize them as a sovereign country.
Well, I'd say because of the threat that they pose to potentially North Korea, which is a country that we,
You mean the South?
Or that's what I mean. South Korea, which we helped groom and develop, and we don't want to empower a potential hostile adversary that's right next to them.
But think about this from the perspective of Korean honor and national pride. What right did we have to occupy the southern portion of that peninsula and impose a military dictatorship against the will of the people that were living there? Just because
imposed in South Korea?
Yes.
I would say that's protecting them and enabling them. I'd say the Soviet Union imposed themselves on North Korea.
Then why did all Soviet troops agree to leave at the request of the North Korean government, whereas U.S. troops didn't leave? To this day, they're still in the South.
I would say to protect them from North Korea, and then protect them from North Korea.
But
and
think
North
about
Korea,
this.
They put somebody in charge.
But don't you think the North also needed protection? They told all the Soviets very early on in the 40s and 50s to leave, totally leave. The Soviet occupation ended in the 40s, but the U.S. occupation continues to this day. How can a country be sovereign if it's occupied by foreign troops, if you are forced to have a foreign military base on your soil?
I would say it's both in their best interest and both in our best interest. I mean, it'd be one thing if they were asking us to leave, but I think they are appreciative.
But why couldn't we let them decide in the 1940s when several protests and rebellions broke out in the South and the military dictatorship we appointed responded by massacring and killing all of them?
Yeah, but you're going to say that a massacre in South Korea compared to what we see in North Korea? I mean, I think you're being really selective here with the facts. I mean, you're citing, one or two people or one or two sources saying that no, North Korea is not this hostile place when we know nothing about it because they make themselves invisible and secretive to the world. But you're talking about this one thing that happened in South Korea.
Maybe a massacre happened after that, but in the 1940s and the 50s, around the Korean War, there were no massacres in the North. There was no observed recorded massacres. And yes, people did have access and knowledge about these things at the time. It was the South and the military dictatorship in the South which had to massacre the Korean people in order to fulfill the US's interests.
But North Korea is in a constant state of massacre. I mean, look what happened to the one kid who went there and took the painting off the wall. They put him in a prison camp and he came back and he was brain dead. That type of thing doesn't happen in South Korea.
Well, that's an example of someone going over to that country from the United States, who they welcomed with open arms and allowed to be in their country. I mean, that's pretty remarkable considering what the United States has done to Korea and our war there, how much people we raped, tortured, bombed, massacred, and killed. So they let this guy in with open arms and he outright disrespected them. He did something he knew he wasn't allowed to. He stole from them and they didn't take too kindly to it.
But that
As
shows
far
their
as
characteristics, though. Like the one glimpse of what happens to you as a punishment inside the country. That's what happens. So I mean, I think
I
that's
think it's
representative of what they are.
I think the Koreans were extremely offended by what he did and took it as a form of extreme disrespect, hence the response that they had.
Yeah. So imagine what it's like there day to day if that's the type of response they have for taking a painting off the wall.
I don't think that that kind of harshness is there for day-to-day citizens because those are actual Koreans who live there and it's their state and it's their country. Whereas a foreigner who comes from a country that is known to Koreans for having done so much horrible atrocities and crimes against them and who to this day is continuing to sanction and embargo them, I think that's not really comparable.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're just going to disagree on this, but we've never seen anything like that in South Korea. It's a place that people feel totally comfortable going to, and
Sure, but it's
even
our colony. We own it.
yeah, but it's a much happier place than North Korea. I mean, that's where technology is developing. They're one of the best technological developing places in the world. They have all sorts of technology
But does that
companies.
actually mean it's happier? Think about it. I mean, what's the suicide rate in South Korea? It's
We
pretty
don't know,
high
yeah,
actually.
and we
Um,
don't know the suicide rate in North Korea because everything's kept secret, and anything that's kept secret isn't something to brag about.
well, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'd be willing to bet my whole life savings that the suicide rate in North Korea is nowhere close to the South because the amount of alienation people in the South experience by losing touch with their communities, their families, being flooded with pornography, widespread confusion as a result of westernization, the adoption of all of these harmful and toxic practices imported through consumerism and this kind of excessive materialism in the bad sense of the word. I think these are things that are socially destructive and harmful and make people more unhappy than they've ever been, maybe in the history of humanity. I think even serfs living in the Middle Ages, in feudal times, were probably happier than people today who, young men can't even get married anymore. They're isolated. They don't even have any social interaction. Women are so terrorized and so much mental anguish and distress from the beauty industry and the standards it imposes upon them. I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that as much as material wealth has been a consequence of what we call capitalism historically, the spiritual destruction that this has wrought upon humanity also shouldn't be underestimated. And I think it's a significant driving factor, as a matter of fact, which is leading people in the direction of questioning these kinds of values and systems.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's a negative side to a lot of these things. I mean, you get the internet, but then you also get, all the bad stuff that comes with it, like porn and distracting things. But we also have all the information in the world at our fingertips. So I think there's a massive positive and, also a negative that comes with all of these things with technology. I mean, cars, it lets us cut the time it takes to go from one place to another and, a tenth of what they used to be. But, it comes with its negatives too. But I don't know, I can't. I think you're really making a crazy statement there, where you say that the quality of life of serfs is better than it is today. I mean, yeah,
I
sure, we
wouldn't
have.
say quality of life, and I'm not against technology. Technology isn't the problem. The problem is the destructive social or antisocial values, I should rather say, that capitalism or capitalist institutions, because we're not really living in classical capitalism anymore, to be real. But these institutions, liberalism and so on, it's imposed so much unhappiness, so much spiritual degradation, so much confusion on people and populations. And there's nothing wrong with technology. But why is it that, for example, the North does have a limited extent of modern, whatever they can get under the conditions they're in? They have modern technology. They're not living in the Middle Ages. But even in China, for example, China's more technologically advanced than the United States, I'd argue. So
No,
maybe
it's
it's a good
not.
example.
They steal all
Well,
of our intellectual property. They can't develop things, and I mean that's a core strength of what capitalism or free market does. Because when you're in a socialist or communist society, you're not incentivized to build the best things. So people aren't going to.
I think if you compare our major cities to China's major cities, it becomes clear which way of life is more advanced technologically in general. Which way of life involves the use of technology in more sophisticated and complex ways. But that's probably not a point we can agree on because it depends on investigating externally. But even if we were to play the devil's advocate, we can agree that China is much more technologically advanced than North Korea. But even then, the way technology is used is compatible with people's social values and communal values. It's compatible with their family values, right? It doesn't tear apart and destroy and alienate and commodify everything about people's lives.
All right, so two things quick though. So one example I could definitely point to with China is the fact that they can't develop the semiconductors that are essential for things like AI or quantum computing or advanced missiles. They could only develop the semiconductors that are used for things like microwaves and basic things like that. So that's why they're so worried about South Korea, and that's why we put the chip sanctions on them, because we know that they can't develop their own stuff with in that regard. And that's an example of they have to rely on our intellectual property to build those things. And then go ahead with that, and then I'll do the second part.
Yeah, I'm just saying I'm a little confused because if China can't develop their own chips, why do we sanction them? If they can't do it, then we don't have to have a reason to sanction them. We could just allow the chips to continue to be manufactured in the Taiwan province and not have to worry about it developing in the mainland. Well, the truth is, China can develop its own chips. It just hasn't been doing that because for the longest time, it's been well integrated in the US-led global economic system, and it's taken for granted those supply chains. Because of the aggressive economic policies against China by the US government, China is beginning actually to become more self-reliant when it comes to the development of chip technologies, and it's making pretty swift and steady progress in that regard. I mean, just recently, Huawei released a smartphone that is totally made in China. The chip is totally developed in China. Now, have they gotten to the 6 nanometer? I think that's what it is.
Or
Point
five,
yet?
yeah, 5 nanometer or whatever.
They haven't yet, but they're getting there. They've just started only recently, and it's not something that can be done overnight.
No,
So
massive
I would,
undertaking.
yeah, but I would highly contest the idea that they can't do it. I mean, if the Taiwan province can make chips and manufacture chips, so can the mainland, which has much more resources and manpower and capital. It's just going to take some time. It's not going to be overnight.
Yeah, but I mean, point to something like that. Point to something like the fact that they only have one what is it, aircraft carrier when we have 20 of them. They can't build that.
Again, I don't think they can't build it. I think it's a matter of priorities. Is it really? Well, I mean, what would you prefer? Would you prefer having the best world class infrastructure in the world, or 20 aircraft carriers? I think I would prefer having the best class, world class infrastructure that allows me to go from Detroit to San Francisco in a few hours by high speed rail. Rather than having the means to police and control the entire world, which, by the way, we can't even do necessarily because of how economically costly it is at the level of having to occupy countries. So I think China, it's not a matter of whether they can or can't do these things. It's what are their priorities. They
But
spend a lot more in their economy and they invest much more in their actual needs of their people than they do on their military.
so why'd
And
they
I
build an
don't,
extra billion units of housing that's not being occupied right now? And then they have like buildings that are falling apart. They have these entire ghost cities. So how is that a bigger priority than building out their navy, which they've spent a ton of money on their navy over the last few years, which I know. So they're up to something with that. Why not build an aircraft carrier when that's one of the most essential things of a navy? Like they have a really short range navy right now, and I don't imagine that's something
right,
they're
because
happy with.
China doesn't have designs on the whole world. They just want to defend their own shores. They want to defend their own waters. But to answer the question about ghost cities and so on, it's actually a common myth. And in terms of Western analysis of China, these cities are empty because they build the cities first, and then people they build them entirely, and they plan these cities from scratch, and then later on people move in for job opportunities, and this can actually take years.
But
So you'll see cities for a period of time being empty, but that's not because they're going to be empty forever. It's just because the process of their city building, that's another topic, by the way, we should get into, takes time. When's the last time we've built a city in the United States? They're building cities, every year. We have not built a new city. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, forget build a new city. When's the last time we've built a major city even?
I mean, we're developed. I mean, I see apartment buildings going up across the entire country, and any city I've been in, I've been across the country a few times, and
Right,
I
but
think we're just building on the existing ones. But no, but that's a fact though that multiple sources have proven and given strong evidence for. That there's literally enough empty units to house the entire population a second time.
But building apartment units and planning entire cities with all the infrastructure and amenities that come with that from scratch is a much different undertaking from the perspective of scale.
But
And
they're
we
doing it.
can't
Oh god,
and we can't do that. We don't have the ability to do it.
no, but they're doing it in a way just to stimulate the economy. Like the vast majority of their economic growth is based off spending on real estate that's not going to be used because it's impossible to use it when literally the amount of units available is equal to the entire population.
I think that many speculators looking at China, not financial speculators, but commentators, think that China is always on the brink of collapse because the investment that they put into their latest city or their latest infrastructure, it's never going to be paid off because it's never going to be used. And then a few years later, what do we see? It is getting used. It does get paid off. It just takes time.
Well, I would say it is on the brink of collapse just because of its demographics alone, which again, going back to government planning, the government screwed themselves up with the one child policy. I mean, I think China would have been a potential contender to be the next reserve currency, but there's no shot in hell they're going to be that now with their population problem.
The population problem is a very long-term issue. It's not an immediate issue, I don't think, in my
Well,
opinion, at
that's why
least.
deflation's happening right now in China because they don't have enough consumers in the younger group. And, when you get older, you stop being a net consumer.
I'm not exactly sure. I would have to investigate more the problem of the source of deflation in China myself. I won't comment on it because I
Hmm.
would probably need to read up more on it. But what I could say is that all I can tell you is that the prediction that China is on the brink of collapse has been happening since the reform and opening up in the 1980s, especially picked up steam in the 1990s after China rejected the Soros-backed color revolutions
Mm.
that took over the rest of Eastern Europe and the rest of the communist countries. So since the 1990s, we've been predicting the imminent collapse of China, and it just hasn't happened. You go to any year, any given year, since the beginning of the internet itself, and you will find many articles by mainstream news media of people predicting the imminent economic collapse of China, and it simply has not happened.
Well, they remind me a lot of what happened with Japan. I mean, you remember how Japan was the talk of the town in the 80s, 90s. They were growing rapidly, and a lot of it was because of real estate debt. And then, what happened? They increased rates a bit, and the economy couldn't handle it, and it came cascading down, and it just decimated the spirit of of Japan. And their population's literally been flat for the last 20, 30 years, and their stock market, I believe, just hit the all-time high that it made in the 90s. So I think that's the direction that China's heading in, personally.
Yeah, in my opinion, I disagree because Japan never had its own reliable and strong economic hinterlands. It never had its own strong base of demand to continue propelling economic activity.
And that's exactly the
Furthermore,
problem. I think with China.
Yeah, but China is so much bigger than Japan, geographically and in terms of the population. And plus, Japan never had a Belt and Road Initiative. Japan never spearheaded this kind of new sovereign-based world economic system, which China is hoping is going to ameliorate that problem by tapping into new markets through win-win economic cooperation. So Japan never had the ability or the capacity to defy the United States and basically try building a totally new world economic system to save its economy. It never had the ability to do that because Japan's economy was built by who? By us, right? Bretton Woods policymakers and planners are the ones who propped up Japan and built Japan's economy. They had the Marshall Plan. They're not like China where they industrialized from scratch and where they basically set up their own sovereign economic system.
Well, we enabled China to get rich. So, I mean, in the 70s, that was kind of the trade-off we made when we got off the gold standard. We're like, all right, if it's going to get too expensive to build shit here, we're going to make China our personal factory. And that, it helped China get rich, helped us keep prices down, and it helped them massively industrialize. And then we put them in the World Trade Organization in the 90s, and then, got even faster from there.
I agree that China saved the global economic system led by the United States because that was collapsing in the 70s. And we needed China much more than they needed us. China would be fine continuing to just grow rice for another 100 years, probably.
Yeah, they were in the Stone Ages, though, back then. I mean, they wouldn't even be in the top 10 of GDP if we didn't do what we did with them. But yes,
what they had is political sovereignty. So they could do that for however long they needed to. It was us who depended on the need for the economic system we have to constantly be fueled. And that was what was collapsing in the 1970s. So China actually rescued the world economy, not just once, but twice, actually, because in 2008, that was the second time where the almost overwhelmingly majority of global economic growth after 2008 was led by China.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that part's true. I agree with that. So let's get into price discovery, because that's something I wanted to bring up with you. Like I said before, I think that the free market is a beautiful, amazing mechanism in terms of price discovery. Do you ever agree with the concept of the government deciding the price of something?
It depends on the context. I don't think it's a matter of principle.
Like minimum wage. Do you agree with minimum wage to determine how much somebody gets paid?
I don't think it's I think minimum wage is a great ideal. It's a great thing to have, but I don't think it's the thing that's going to solve the need for people to have decent wages. I think the primary thing that's going to solve that problem is investing in your productive forces, investing in your technology, investing in economic growth in general, which is something the government has to do in the first place. So I like to focus more on the material economy, what things are actually being produced and built in the first place, and how do you go about ensuring that that kind of material wealth will grow in the first place. It's not a matter of principle for me. For example, China might have a minimum wage, but they don't see just raising the minimum wage as the solution if they want to expand the overall wealth of their population. You have to actually invest in your productive forces. So I see these policy disagreements, which are often between Democrats and Republicans over economic policy. I see them as distractions. I mean, what are we even talking about in the first place when, for example, the monopoly on credit and the monopoly on our monetary system, on our currency, is literally controlled by a private cartel of banks? How can we even talk about sound economic policy when it's not even our policy to make in the first place, but the policy of Wall Street and the City of London?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's the government that enabled this economic problem where they're artificially controlling interest rates through the Federal Reserve. I mean, I think it's insane that the market doesn't determine what interest rates are, because that's the reason for this excessive borrowing. And then it gets to the point where the government has to bail them out because of how much they borrow, that they're systematically important. So
right, but we should remember the Federal Reserve isn't the government. That's a private cartel of banks.
But they decide rates, though.
Absolutely, and that's the problem. It's a private cartel of banks, and interest rates, as you know.
Who's their boss, though? Their boss is Congress.
That's where I disagree. I think that I think the reverse is actually true. I think Congress takes its orders from the banks rather than the reverse.
No, but the president appoints the head of the Federal Reserve, and then the Congress oversees the Federal Reserve, and Congress is the power of the purse. They decide when we spend money on things. You know, like when we
Right,
did the
but
COVID
who
printing,
who decides who gets elected as president or who gets elected into the Congress?
say a collection of media, military, industrial complex,
Right.
pharma,
It's
all
the
those players.
banks.
They're part of the group, yeah.
I mean, but they're the ones who wield in the last instance, the control. Even big pharma and the media, who finances them in the last instance? It's banks, right? Very few. I don't think there's any businesses in the modern age that just make profit just based on sales and that's it. You always need investment. You always need loans. You need to be tapped in um,
Mm-hmm.
to the
Right.
investors, right?
Yep.
And that's I mean, BlackRock is formalizing that with the ESGs actually, right?
Yeah.
Which is going to determine who does and doesn't get investments based on who conforms to whatever values they establish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really in the last instance the financial elites who control everything, including the government.
But that's corporatism, though, and I think that that's what America has right now, and that's what we need to fight against. Because I think in a free market, this wouldn't be happening. But we have corporatism where the government is aiding and helping out these companies get in the position of strength they have.
I agree with that, but we need to strongly emphasize and investigate the question. How did it get to that point? Because it wasn't always the case. We did have something close to a free market before the rise of the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the robber barons and so on and so forth. And we did have an event in 1907, actually, where the whole economy was on the brink of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
The bank runs of the Panic of 1907. I'm not sure if you heard of it.
Oh yeah, and Morgan had to bail it out.
And Morgan, in his private capacity, bringing together all of the major bankers in America, he sat them in a room and they bailed out the economy just purely by the private sector. I mean,
Yep.
think of the dependency on just a handful of people that puts everyone at the mercy of. And it comes as no surprise that they eventually formalized that system in the Federal Reserve. And the problem this all can be traced to is the way in which the private sector was able to gobble up all of the rent bearing infrastructure and resources such as oil and such as railroads, which gave them a guaranteed source of rent income, which they could use as a form of security to lend out interest bearing loans. And that's how they all became these bankers, right? Rockefeller and Morgan, they all became big bankers.
Yeah.
And it was because of their initial ability to control the common infrastructure and resources of the country. So, as a communist, it's a scary word, but I think the thing that's the most persuasive to me is like, if these banking interests can control our whole society through the control of these monopolies, then doesn't that have any bearing on our political sovereignty? Shouldn't, in order for us to be sovereign, don't we need to control our railroads and our oil? Because we should also keep this in mind. The thing that's called Morganization actually did optimize and improve the railroad systems. It was more efficient as a monopoly than it would have been under anarchic conditions of competition. It literally standardized the railroad system in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And a similar case could be made for Rockefeller as well. So monopolies in and of themselves weren't even necessarily bad. They
Well, yeah, that,
standard.
that developed the country in a crazy way. I mean, you know, but like
Yeah.
before people paint those guys in a bad light, yeah, like, yeah, sure, they did some stuff that was undesirable, but they made America a whole different thing than it was prior to them.
Right. But the issue is the people and the popular sovereignty got left out of the equation. You know, these things that were built initially by the free market eventually became to be, you know, common realities that we all depend on that aren't markets anymore. They're just yielding rents. And historically, you know, that is something that is of the common interest, the common thing. That's what res publica means in republic, right? It's an issue that concerns the existence and the reality of the republic. So
But
that's what communism really means to me. It's that things like this belong to the realm of the common interest. It should be accountable to us as a people.
But when you say they got left behind and it belongs to the common interest, I wouldn't say they got left behind because, Rockefeller, he made the price of oil cheaper and, he made it consistent when it was a volatile market. Vanderbilt, he made people have the ability to have, instant transportation, probably drove down the price of all the commodities and goods that got sent on trains. So that's not getting left behind. That's having your life improved.
Well, if you look at it just economically, sure, there were a lot of benefits in terms of the decreasing of prices and stuff. But what about at the level of our sovereignty and our constitution? What about at our level of being able to have a republic that serves our interests, right? At that level, what we saw was that the banking systems that these monopolies gave rise to were able to totally hijack and take over our country and eventually do things that I think you and I would both agree are harmful from the perspective of of our interests as a people. And that's the issue. I mean, we have no way to challenge these things that are harmful to our interests because we're not the ones that the government is accountable to anymore in the first place.
Well, I mean, I think that part of the problem is that people are far too little engaged in dealing with their congressional representatives because Congress has much more power than we would like to think. And I mean, a united Congress behind a common issue could move mountains, and people aren't fixated on that enough. I mean, we have a bunch of swamp creatures in Congress right now who don't give a shit about what we want and don't work in our best interest. But I think if that was the case and they were holding these companies accountable for things instead of just, trying to get us angry at these corporations like Elizabeth Warren does, I think that we could be a lot more effective in holding them at bay at least and not letting them abuse their power. But the government enables them to do these things a lot of the time because we're not holding them accountable enough.
I agree with that, ideally speaking, but I guess what I'm cynical about, and I don't know if it's just cynicism, is that it seems like anybody who ever calls out the swamp creatures and tries to mobilize people to do the things you're talking about seems to get taken down by the system, seems to disappear, seems to get trumped up charges against them, seems to maybe get assassinated, right? And that's really the problem, is that we have no way of using the government system that we have before us in order to fulfill our interests because it's rigged. It's a fundamentally rigged system.
I mean, yeah, it definitely is, but by comparison, I don't think it's as bad as it is in these places that call themselves communist. Because, I mean, I just know, like, any person that I talk to from Cuba, from Russia, from China, from even Vietnam, they talk about the horrors that they escaped. So, I mean, why is it that it hasn't worked anywhere? Why is it that everybody that comes from these places talks about how horrible it was, how they were put in prison if they had any type of political dissent? Like, I mean, here we could go on Twitter and tell the president of the United States to go fuck himself, but can't do that in a country like Russia or China or Cuba. So, I mean, so I don't understand how
the reason you can't do that in those countries is because people's voices actually matter. So when you're saying fuck the president, you are actually calling out and challenging the president. You're challenging his power and authority. When I say that here, I'm not doing that because who am I? I'm a nobody. What I say doesn't matter. I have no stake in this system. I'm just some guy, that doesn't matter. But in those countries, people have the benefit of mattering. It does matter what people think. It does matter what they say. It does matter what they do and how they protest. Government takes it seriously because it knows that its whole reason for existence, the whole basis of its existence, is being responsive to the population. Not responsive to these kind of corporations and to these private interests.
So responsive customer service is killing you or putting you in jail if you have any type of dissent? I mean,
well, no, it's not customer service, it's power. That's the sovereign authority. If you're going to call out and challenge the authority, you better have the balls to do it. You better have a good grounding and standing to do it on. For example, I am willing to challenge the authority of the deep state because I think I do have a good standing. I think that the American people are getting ripped off. I think that they're being treated unjustly. So that's a standing that I'm willing to defend and willing to fight for. So if you are going to go and say, fuck Putin or something, you should be responsible for whatever standing you have to say that because you're calling him out. You're calling out the existing authority and the existing power there. And if you're just going to do it for no reason at all, well, sorry, I don't really find that. I mean, it's a different culture. You have to keep that in mind. It's respect has a totally different meaning in these kinds of countries, right? They regardless of what government system they have, whether it's communist or otherwise, they have a different civilization. They don't just have this view where you can just go say whatever you want without any consequences. And that's true even in South Korea, for example. You in South Korea, you can't say whatever you want. And that's true for most Asian countries, actually, in most Eastern societies. But what I'm trying to say is it's not the same thing as where government is being abused in such a way that it's being weaponized against their own people. You know, having to respect the sovereign authority is not the same thing as the sovereign authority being weaponized by private interests to poison, degrade, and destroy and corrupt the people of a country against their best interests.
Yeah, but I mean that we're able to say these things because we have freedom of speech, because we have a strong constitution here. Nobody else has a strong constitution. And you're saying it's so bad that these companies, use our government via lobbying to do these things to us from a, death by a thousand cuts standpoint. But how is that worse than a government just brute force taking you out for having the slightest bit of dissent? I mean, over the last 4 years, there's been dozens of oligarchs in Russia that have just disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. So, because they're not happy with the war. So, I mean, if Putin's able to take them out, then who else? No, then nobody's safe by any means.
Well, it's not. If you have dissent in China or Russia, they're not just going to take you out. Usually, nothing will happen. But if you're going to seriously challenge the authority of the state at a level that's effective and that matters, you are going to get a response. And but that's also true here. And actually, it's probably worse here in many ways, because I think that the grievances that dissidents have in America are much more legitimate than the grievances that dissidents in Russia have. Most of the dissidents in Russia, a lot of these people are nihilistic, they're antisocial, they're kind of like Satanists. They just want to infect society with corruption and liberalism, and they want to be able to do whatever they want without having any accountability or responsibility. Dissidents in America are just trying to be a voice for the people and say that, hey, why are our trains derailing and why are our people getting poisoned in East Palestine, Ohio, while we're getting, robbed with taxes and all of it being sent into Ukraine? We have a much more legitimate basis for having grievances with our government, which isn't unlike China, unlike Russia. It's not delivering. And, I would be so happy if we had a government like Russia's, in the sense of jailing and putting oligarchs and cracking down on them. In our country, it's the opposite. The oligarchs totally control our government in every respect, in every way, and they have total free reign and total impunity.
But I mean, Putin's a multi-billionaire, though. He's possibly the richest person in the world. So how's that not corruption?
I've never been presented with any evidence of that, though.
But there's overwhelming amounts of evidence that say that could be the richest person in the world. And have you seen his house? It's a insane mega mansion.
I heard about that, but again, there's no evidence for it.
No, there's video evidence of it.
But where's the proof that that's his house?
That people have shown him walking into it.
Again, I have yet to see anything like that.
And that's why Navalny probably got taken out, because he would do all those drone videos of his house.
But Navalny had no popular support in Russia. Navalny represented.
There were protests when he died, though.
But why should oligarchs have the interest to overthrow the government and cause mass civil unrest just because the government's not doing what they want?
They shouldn't, but they also shouldn't be swiftly killed for speaking out against the government.
Well, that's not, if they are being killed, that's not why. If they're being killed, it's because they're betraying their country and they're selling their country out to foreign interests, which oftentimes these oligarchs are doing because they care more about they care more about money than their own homeland.
Well, that's a whole lot of them, because I mean, there's a list of literally 50 of them who have died since the Ukraine-Russia war started.
I don't know if that's true, but if it is, they most definitely probably deserved it, in my opinion.
Interesting. So, again, so can you give me an example of a place where communism has worked out in a great way, where you'd want to model something off of? Like, paint me a picture of your model economy.
It wouldn't be the same in every regard, because we're a different country with a different culture and history. But I think China is just the most obvious example of an effective form of communism in the 21st century.
But they used capitalism to grow themselves. Now they're trying to insert socialism and then communism into that.
But if it was proposed that America does 5% of the things that China does, Americans, the conservative right would immediately say that it's communism. Because, for example, in China, about I think 60% of their economy is controlled entirely by the government. All of the land is still owned by the state. The state-owned enterprises continue to dominate the entire economy. Have they introduced the dynamism of markets, specifically as a form of the integration into the information economy and all the dynamism that comes with that? Absolutely. But I really wouldn't call it capitalism, because in capitalism, it's profits that are in command. Whereas in China, how they measure their overall prosperity and the goals of economic production isn't just in the form, or even primarily in the form of profit. It's in the form of how effectively they're able to reach their concrete material goals. How much high-speed rail are we building? How much housing are we building? How much are we actually doing?
But the entire property development sector is collapsing. I mean, their biggest one just went into default last year. And, they're literally at the point where people are having to put down payments on houses that have not been built yet. And then they're getting screwed because they've been paying into the mortgage for 2 years where the thing hasn't even been built, and then the country goes bankrupt. So how's that fulfilling what they promised?
I mean, I'm not sure about all of that, but what I do know is that in China, they have an over 90% home ownership rate versus here, which is what? I mean,
but that's accounting for people who own 2 homes, though.
No, if you own minimum 1 home in China, you're counted as a homeowner.
But their homeless population's almost 100 million. So how could that be the case?
But where are you getting that they have a homeless population of 100 million?
It was a government website.
I haven't seen that myself, but I will say that I highly doubt it.
Well, they have from what I've seen, they have a massive homeless population that they go out of their way to hide, and they, kind of scatter them off to an area where people can't see them.
So where are they?
In this slum somewhere, and there's a huge underground.
I've never seen slums in mainland China. I mean, the closest thing,
they don't let you.
So there's no one has ever taken camera footage of these slums in China.
There are YouTube videos of guys showing that these places that look decimated in China, but it's looks like a real sketchy operation of what he has to do to highlight that stuff.
I don't. The closest thing to slums China's ever had, to the best of my knowledge, were makeshift encampments by Hukou migrants into major cities who were just temporarily building these kinds of shanty towns. I don't know what you call them, because these were temporary construction projects and they were going to move on very shortly after. And because they already had homes in the countryside, that's the most important thing. So they're just kind of economic migrants looking to make money in the cities, but that's not their actual home. Their actual home is still in the countryside with where their family is and so on. So, but beyond that, I'm just hearing this for the first time, that China has this huge homeless population and has these slums. I mean, I've never, maybe it's true. I don't know everything, but from what I know about China, I highly doubt it.
Well, think about it just from the standpoint of what other major cities in the world have going on, or highly densely populated areas. Like, of course, there's going to be slums. Like, there's a wealth gap anywhere in any situation, no matter how communist you are, there's going to be a wealth gap.
China's wealth gap isn't the same as ours, though, because here we find it hard to believe, but there's nothing like Los Angeles in China. There's nothing like New York City. Shanghai has nothing in terms of the drug addicts and homeless people on the streets and all this kind of stuff. And this form of this form of poverty that's mired with all of this social chaos doesn't exist in China. Poverty in China, very serious, I'm not denying it's serious, takes a different form. It takes the geographic form of the difference between the rural and the urban ways of life. But even the poverty that exists in China is still in the context of, people who have solid family and communal connections. Just people live a more backward, I guess you would call it, more primitive way of life, more old-fashioned way of life. They don't have a lot of access to material goods. But it's not poverty like in Los Angeles, where, people are just high on drugs, running around, totally getting themselves killed. And there's all these gangs and shootouts and crime and stuff. So even poverty in China is just really not that bad if you look at it from the perspective of human dignity.
So,
It's bad in the sense that it's not as developed as in the cities, but it still works in terms of being able to reproduce cultural, civilizational, and communal values.
well, so from the standpoint of drugs, they don't. I agree they don't have a drug problem because I remember even Trump said this one time. He said Xi said they have no drug problem there because he said, yeah, quick trial, because if you get caught with drugs there, it's like boom, boom, harsh punishment. So yes, I can see that standpoint that they don't have a drug problem because of that. Homeless problem, I'd argue that, and there's a lot of evidence to show this, that they escort or expel people from homeless people from their nice areas and send them off to an area where they can't be seen. And there's these large groups where there's actually a black market for organs from these people in these areas. And then in terms of home affordability, so there's this ratio that shows how many years of an average salary it takes to buy an average price house. In America, the worst ones are LA and New York. Takes around 10, 12 years of the average salary to buy an average house. China and Beijing and Shanghai, it takes 46 years of an average salary to buy an average price house. So there's a huge percentage of people who are living with their parents or giving up on the concept of getting married because it's just not happening.
I wouldn't doubt that the price of homes, I don't know, but in Beijing and Shanghai are very high, but those are two cities among thousands in China, right?
Well,
You
they're the
have to
most
put
extreme
in,
examples, but it's a nationwide problem, home affordability, because like you said,
I disagree. The home ownership rate in China is over 90%. That's
because
incredible.
well, it's because that's the only thing they feel comfortable investing in because they don't trust their stock market. So the vast majority of household wealth is tied up in real estate, and a lot of them, they own a second home just as a real estate asset because they know the government keeps propping up the real estate market because that's the
I'm
driver of
not sure
GDP.
if most Chinese people own two homes, but regardless,
A lot do.
I don't think they have a home ownership problem in China. I think maybe there's problems in the real estate market and at the financial level of the loans and the kind of debts that are bundled up in that for these huge companies, and at the level of their solvency and at the level of their viability and sustainability. But for an actual individual or a family in China, homeownership is not really a problem in China.
Well, the government has been highly involved in the concept of incentivizing people to buy homes in terms of lowering rates or changing the structure of the mortgages. So it's like when they're facing deflationary pressures, they cut rates and encourage people to buy. When they face inflationary pressures, they try to quell that. But it's also a systematic risk because their entire economy is heavily dependent on the price of real estate. Like if real estate prices start going down in China, their economy is going down with it, and along with people's life savings, which would not be good for politics.
All I can say is that people in China can own and live in homes without these exorbitant and ridiculous rents that most Americans
Oh,
have to face.
that's not true. There's a huge amount of Chinese citizens that have to live with their parents because of how expensive and unaffordable houses are, and they have to start paying for homes before they're even built. So the real estate problem in China, I would contend, is a massive problem. And yes, it's also a massive problem in the U.S.
Well,
because
it's
of
not universally a massive problem. It could be a problem in some of their biggest and most major cities, but there's thousands of cities in China. They're continuing to build more cities and they're continuing to develop the rural areas. And even if they're not doing the best job of it, they're doing it a million times better than anything we can imagine here, where people just can't afford to live. And people are going homeless in this country because rents are so high, because it's impossible to own a home in pretty much in the United States for a huge majority of people, it seems like. I mean, I'm not saying that, there's not a lot of people in Shanghai or Shenzhen or Beijing who have to live with their parents because they can't afford a home. But look at it at the level of the overall national statistics, over 90% homeownership rate. That's
yeah,
incredible.
I have a hard time trusting that stat. especially from China when it's hard to get an independent
Sure,
researcher in there.
but all I can say is I just encourage everyone to do their own independent research. It's really all I
Yeah,
can say here.
and I totally agree with the concept of the U.S. houses being too expensive, and I mean there's a million problems that go into that. First of all, there's been a shortage of starter homes being built in the last 20 years or so, a lot because of commodity prices, because of unnecessary tariffs, because of zoning regulations, because of corporations buying up houses. Yes, so I mean, I'm of the belief that the best thing the economy could do is from the supply side make food, housing, energy as cheap as possible, but not from a government enforcement, from like the same way that what's a good example? So when plasma screen TVs first came out, they were like $10,000, right? And now you can get a flat screen TV for $400 maybe at the store. So that same concept applied to housing, food, and energy, which can be done if we embrace something like nuclear energy, which is much more efficient and powerful than all the oil and solar stuff that we use right now. And that would enable things like vertical farming, which would make food much cheaper because it's dependent on energy desalination, energy dependent. And then,
But
that
who's
gets,
going to invest in nuclear?
why are you saying? Because it's not profitable?
I mean it's not even thinkable that the private sector would do this.
Why is Bill Gates doing it?
Bill Gates is going to bring nuclear energy to America? I doubt it.
He has a massive nuclear energy project underway right now.
I just I don't know the details of it, but I can already predict that it's going to be nowhere near as big in scale as it would need to be to accomplish the things you describe in terms of lowering the prices of housing and food and all these other things.
But would you agree that if those three things, the price were just driven down from a supply side standpoint, where it's able to be made so cheaply that the cost of it's lower, that would be a net positive for the economy?
Ideally, yes, but I think the problem when it comes to things that are based in monopolies and rents, and housing is one of the biggest examples of this, is that um, there's not a supply side incentive to take out huge loans and investments to build a bunch of new housing on the cheap when you can just increasingly raise rents, and there's no way to challenge that, and there's no way to compete with it because the amount of capital you have to take out to build housing in the first place there's such a high barrier to entry for that in the first place. And the issue with the housing market is that it's so heavily based in speculation that there's an incentive for things to constantly keep going up and up for people to turn a profit, because a lot of people just buy homes to sell them at a later time to make a huge profit. So how is it that the market is going to solve the problem when it's already set up? And you mentioned China and what China's been doing. The reason there's so much controversy about what China's doing is it's literally cracking down on speculation in the housing market and forcing these housing real estate companies to deliver on their homes to the people that they bought it from them, even if it comes at the price of making them bankrupt. That's how much China's prioritizing the need for people to live in homes, for homes to be built for people to live in, rather than just to be kind of financial tools and assets.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I just think incentive is a much more powerful motivator than force. And what I would do if I was president, which I intend to run someday, is I would incentivize home builders by saying, all right, we need more starter homes. If you build a starter home, you will not be capital gains taxed on that starter home. So, it's not profitable for them to build starter homes right now because, where they get taxed 27% once they build it, flip it. All right, boom, unlock 27% of what they could possibly make on it. Does that increase it by 10% output? Okay, that's a pretty big dent in it. That would drive the price down. If it goes from an average of 350 to an average of 270, 250, 225, that's a big difference.
I think the problem with that is, as you and I both know, the monopolies that control the economy, taxes don't really disproportionately affect them. They disproportionately affect the little guy who's trying to pursue
Well,
economic opportunity.
they
That's what
impact the
taxes.
corporations. It's not like the people who own a lot of equity. Yes, it doesn't impact them because they're not taxed on their assets sitting in stock or sitting in real estate.
Right,
But it impacts
exactly.
like a corporate tax cut's a big deal though.
I think there's room for argument at that level because corporations, that's kind of a separate topic. But to get to the actual point of what you're talking about, I think the problem, though, is that I don't think this would incentivize the construction of new homes on a mass scale, because the barrier to entry for housing to be built from scratch, the amount of capital that you need to do that for the average person is just very insurmountable, right? It's very inaccessible. And the housing market, by and large, is controlled by monopolies. Most of these landlords are part of huge kind of corporations and monopolies. BlackRock and Vanguard are big examples, but there's also others.
It was enabled by the government.
Yeah, but these are not just individuals, owning these kinds of homes and whatever, just doing it as entrepreneurs. The barrier to entry for some manage to do it, but by and large, the barrier to entry to do that kind of thing is just too high. And the housing market is rigged by these kinds of by these commercial banks, basically, which have every incentive in the world. Doesn't matter how much taxes are going to be cut for them, to steadily increase the price of housing and the price of rents, because it increases it's like increasing the value of your stocks, right? It's literally the underlying logic behind how they're able to remain solvent and profitable and not go bankrupt, like how many of them are in China right now, because the government's cracking down on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, so there was a time 50, 70 years ago where it was feasible for the average person to take out a bank loan, build a house, flip it, and do it again and again and again. So, I mean, I think that's where, the free market was actually in a better state, and that's been eroded over time by government, like I think we agree on. And I think that's the thing that needs to be focused on, rather than overhauling the system to something where it's total government control.
Well, I mean, I disagree. You mentioned, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. I mean, we're talking about when government made it a policy for, people to be able to take out loans for affordable housing, with the GI Bill, with Glass-Steagall, which separated investment banking from commercial banking.
Yeah.
All of these things eventually either got reversed or, they no longer applied to future generations. And that was a result of actually, and many ways, a destruction of government regulation of the banking system.
Yeah, the reversal of Glass-Steagall, yeah, for sure. I mean, so I just the part that I'm not seeing eye with you on, or like I'm not understanding how you're coming from this perspective of, like, you're worried about business influencing government to do things incorrectly, but then you trust government to do things the correct way on its own. So how
I trust government that is infused with the popular will and with popular sovereignty to do the right thing. That's not our government. And in order to have a government like that, I can't really say too much, but I doubt it's a government we're going to get from an election. I think that's a government that will only really be built after the current one collapses, which seems really kooky to suggest, but I think it's increasingly a plausible expectation if we can just see how. I mean, we are $34 trillion in debt. I don't see how we're getting out of this. I don't see a way out as far as the madness of the US's current political system, other than a collapse of, the whole thing. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I think that the two-party system's a big part of this problem that's been run so badly, because, we don't get I think the influence of people is watered down by the concept of a two-party system, because it's like, it's like the same concept as a monopoly, when you have a lack of options, when there's systematic power, and people who create laws, like, they have this built-in infrastructure and these two completely opposing beliefs that make it impossible for somebody else who's a normal right-minded person to run for it. I think that's where a lot of these issues come from. And then these people who are run through the chute and selected, they're easily influenced by lobbyists. So, I mean, I think that's the systematic problem. And I mean, it's also a problem that the U.S. debt is so attractive to the rest of the world, because, I don't know, have you ever heard of Triffin's dilemma?
No, actually, I haven't.
So it's the concept of being the reserve currency holder. You have to simultaneously make sure the rest of the world has an adequate amount of your money and can keep inflation under control within your own economy. So
I haven't heard of that name for it, but I know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like a real, I think, systematic mechanic problem with the reserve currency concept that puts us in this situation where we have to I don't know if Congress is aware of this. I don't think that that's smart to be doing. I think they just want to spend money to this degree, but it's also apparently something that the rest of the world needs, is this amount of dollars being infused into it. Otherwise it shrivels up because
As a
you need dollars.
stable reserve currency. It's the Bretton Woods system. But I also, another incentive for us going into debt is, think of the political implications. Who are we going in debt to? Who owns the majority of our debt? And you'll see the Federal Reserve owns a huge portion of that debt. It's the private sector that owns the most of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a relationship that puts our government in a position of subservience to interests that are unaccountable to us.
Yeah.
And I think that's really my whole argument. And I think the whole global Bretton Woods system with the rise of BRICS is coming to an end. And I think that this system that we're talking about is coming to an end on the horizon. So the question I think we should ask ourselves is, what does it mean to have an alternative financial system that we're probably going to have to build from scratch?
Yeah.
What would it mean to have a sovereign currency that's not the reserve currency of the world, but is a currency that is American, right, for America, and is tailored to America, right, and America's needs and interests? So these are the things that interest me as far as economic questions. To me, the economy and politics are not separate categories.
You can't understand one without understanding the other.
Right.
No, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think we have probably 10, 15 years left of the dollar being the reserve currency, because it's a big undertaking to unravel that. And we're in, I don't know if you ever heard of the fourth turning concept.
Yeah, by Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he popularized it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the concept of every 100 years, society kind of starts up and builds itself up, and then erodes over the course of 100 years and fizzles out. And then you have to build kind of a new system. So, and then also, like, it goes hand in hand with the American Revolution, Civil War, World War II, and then here we are now, and it coincides also with the reserve currencies. Those will also last about 100 years, so we're at around 80-year mark right now. And like I said, China's not going to be it, because they're not in a position where, I think China has peaked in terms of GDP growth. Like, people anticipate them outpacing the U.S. in the next few years or so. I don't think that's the case. I'm sure we disagree on that, but we'll see. I think the next reserve currency, I think they're trying to make it a global reserve currency that's like CBDC based, which that scares the shit out of me. I think that'd be bad for everybody if a centralized world government had control over the currency. I mean, what do you think about that?
A centralized world government seems like a contradiction in terms. I mean, how can you govern the world? And that's just like a shadow, unaccountable institution controlling the world. And
and that's what I think about communism, to be honest, because I mean, I think it's just communism on a bigger scale.
Well, I disagree with that, because communism is always within a specific national, or at least civilizational, context. Communism isn't just some unaccountable shadow elite controlling everyone. Communism is always a form of sovereign power that is within a national or civilizational context, answerable to a concretely constituted people, right? A people who are historically determined as a people, just like there's an American people, a Russian people, a Chinese people. So I disagree with that. I think that that thing that you're describing would be very difficult for countries that have always been consistent on preferring their own sovereignty over falling in line as far as what these kind of Anglo-Saxon financial institutions want. So Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, even Cuba, Venezuela. What's going to make why would they want to fall in line for this kind of
I don't think
new world order?
It's not that I think they do. I think that the UN is the one really pushing this, and I think that's why we see so much forced migration into these European countries, into America. We see migration everywhere, and I think that's to erode the culture of these countries, to make it easier to transition to that. I think that's what they're trying to do.
I'm not sure about that, but what I would say is that I think the way that we can solve this problem globally, or how it could be solved, we is kind of stretching it. I don't think I could do anything myself, but I could speculate as far as how could this problem be solved globally. China, Russia, the US, everyone needs to come together, come to the table, and devise a new global economic system and build a new reserve currency that's not, giving power to some centralized government, but is an agreement between sovereign governments as far as a new paradigm for global development and global banking and reserve currencies. The institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and the ones that are based off of the Bretton Woods system, the dollar as the reserve currency, finally the petrodollar system.
Mhm.
These are all things which serve the purpose of a cartel of private interests. They come at the expense of the developmental needs of countries in the world. They come at the expense of our interests in the United States and the West at large. And they come at the expense of already, developing sovereign nations like China and Russia. So, in
Mhm.
my view, what we need is a new system that integrates and balances out everyone's interests in terms of their developmental needs. And, I don't think we can have that kind of system as long as America and Europe are being ruled by these kind of like vampires. I don't know what else to call them, these dynastic elites
Mhm.
who are willing to literally start World War III before relinquishing their hold on power.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I can agree with that. That I think the military industrial complex has a undue amount of influence, and that's not good for anybody. But I think the main thing that we differ on is that we think that you think that the government would be more efficient at developing a type of system like that, and I think that people with a private sector mindset would be more effective at developing something like that. I mean, like take Trump for example. He mentioned the story the other day at one of his speeches about how he was watching the New York government trying to build the ice rink outside of his hotel or outside of his building for years and years and years. They were spending these millions of dollars on it, and he got sick of seeing that. So he took over the project, and it turned out they were trying to use like a refrigerator company to do the thing, and they were doing it in a stupid way. So he reaches out to the Canadian hockey team to ask them how to build an ice rink. They tell him how to do it. They do it in a cheaper way, faster way, and boom, done. So, I mean, private sector mentality is focused on efficiency, speed, saving money. Government mentality, it's not their own money they're spending, so they spend money more stupidly. And I think, that's, and then in these communist situations, you get the party members that, end up being rich, end up being first in line to get hooked up with stuff, and then money's just spent really inefficiently.
Well, I disagree with the comparison to communism. I think that it's true that the US government is totally incompetent, doesn't know how to do anything, whether it's local state governments, whether it's the federal government. It's just totally just a complete disaster, and it's totally inefficient. But we should also keep in mind our government is occupied. It's designed that way. It's designed not to get things done. It's designed to be ineffective because it's designed to um, fulfill the austerity measures of the banks that they're indebted to. Our government can't do things effectively because our government is literally in debt to unaccountable interests. I do think government should be run like a business. That's exactly how China's state-owned enterprises are run. They're not run on the basis of political favoritism or direct implementation of policy. They're run like businesses. They have to take into account what is the most efficient and resourceful way to do this. See, the distinction between the private interest and the common interest isn't a managerial distinction. It's not an administrative distinction. It's not a distinction between, how you go about doing the thing you need to do. It's a difference in terms of sovereignty. Who are you accountable to? And it's that accountability to me which makes or breaks it. Government should have the same dynamism that the private sector is able to exhibit. And that requires decentralization. It requires, having government state-owned enterprises be run like businesses and have to pull their own and compete on the market and stuff like that. But when all is said and done, in the last instance, they have to serve a sovereign interest. They have to be accountable to our popular sovereignty. Foreign interests shouldn't be able to just come and hijack them and use them for willy-nilly just because of the exchange rate of, that it's convertible into the currency so they can buy it and do whatever they want with it.
Mhm.
It needs to be the common goals and common interests of America need to be fulfilled in the last instance. Now, how they're fulfilled, there could be a lot of wiggle room. There could be a lot of nuance. But that's what
Hmm.
defines your sovereignty. Is it going to be done or not? How it gets done, whether it's an entrepreneur doing it or whether it's a direct implementation of policy or whether it's a state-owned enterprise, that should be based on what works the best. But
Hmm.
what things are being done is a question of sovereignty. That's really my view.
Yeah. So, two things. So, China, I mean, you say they run themselves like a business, but China's M2 money supply is actually twice the size of America's, which is horrifying for them, seeing as America's GDP is bigger than China. So, that means there's more money in terms of dollars inside China's economy kicking around than there is in the US. And that's a result of the government and the central banks there. So, you can't necessarily say that their central banks are run responsibly. And then, number two, you say you want to see state owned enterprises being competitive, but who are they competing with? That's why there's no competitiveness in terms of price and doing things efficiently when it's run by the government, because they're competing with themselves.
I think Huawei is a great example of a state-owned enterprise which is very competitive and which does well. It's competing on the world market ultimately. And in terms of infrastructure and resources, I mean, you may disagree with this, but it's opinion I hold very strongly that China has world class, probably among the best infrastructure per scale in the entire world, like without equal, right? And these are things that are being done by state-owned enterprises. Um, Regarding this stuff about there's more dollars circulating in China's economy than in America's, I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. Could
So
you?
the M2 money supply, like how during COVID we increased the M2 money supply in the US by like 40%. It went from I think 15
Yeah,
trillion to 20 trillion or something like that. So
yeah.
that's the amount of money in circulation in the economy. China has twice the size of our M2 money supply in their economy kicking around. That's money that's created by the government, whether it's
Yeah.
America created that money, China created that money within its government.
But I think the difference is that when China injects money into their economy, it's a productive investment. It's not just leading to runaway
Well, they
inflation.
did it to bail out the failing companies the last few times they did. One of them was Evergrande. The other one was the hell was it? It was their biggest real estate developer that they
Didn't they tell the real estate developers that they're basically on their own? They're not going to bail them out.
They did, but they bailed out a few of them over the past 3 years, from like 2021 until last year. They bailed out some of the bigger ones.
Until recently, though, they said we're done bailing you guys out. You're done. You're clearly not. You're
Yeah,
clearly not economically viable if you keep failing like this. So they're cutting
yeah.
them off, and I think that's actually a good. I wish we would do the same here, but we instead of that we reward these kind of failing financial institutions because they ultimately own us, right? I mean, in
Yeah, the
2008,
government bails them out. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in 2008 it was ridiculous. Private actors competing on the market like all of us were bailed out by the government using our tax dollars, and we basically had no say in it.
Hmm. But again, that leads back to the government mismanaging the economy, which is what I'm completely against, and why I like the concept of a centralized government in a socialist or communist situation is horrifying to me.
I think our disagreement is going to probably rest on this. In my opinion, I think the government is going to manage the economy in whatever proportion, regardless of whatever system you have. It's just a fact of modern economics. So the question comes down to, is government managing the economy in the way that serves the common interest or that serves the interests of a private cartel of banks or a private ruling class? And I think that's really the most meaningful distinction to me.
Hmm.
I can't really envision in the 21st century a kind of laissez-faire free market economy being possible where the government basically doesn't play a major role in the economy. I have yet to see a single example of this being possible, or I don't even know how it could be imaginable, but that's just my perspective, I guess.
Hmm. No, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like, there's certain things that government money just naturally has to flow towards, and especially in emergency situations, But I think the less the better. And I'm so in terms of banking, because you keep referring back to that. So what would you like to see in terms of the banking sector? Do you want the banking sector to be all under the umbrella of the government?
Yeah, I think we should have instead of the central bank system, we should have a national bank. And it's funny, it seems like this was the intention of some of our founding fathers. Hamilton wrote about the proposal of a national bank, which is
Which is kind
supposed
of
to.
like the Fed.
No, actually, we had a national bank until it was dissolved under Andrew Jackson for a
Well,
few
that
decades.
was America's second central bank, though, that he
Yeah, I believe
dissolved.
you. Yeah,
You
that
you
he
were the creature
dissolved.
from Jekyll Island, right?
The Federal Reserve came in the early 1900s. What I'm
Yeah,
talking about,
1913.
yeah, what I'm talking about is like the 1830s when
Yeah,
the.
yeah. There was two central banks in America. There was one that ended in 1812, and coincidentally, the War of 1812 happened right after because the Rothschilds were the
Well,
ones
it
who.
wasn't. It wasn't a central bank necessarily. It was a national bank, meaning it
Yeah, that's what
was
they called
controlled by
it.
the government.
But it had the ability to issue money
Yeah, exactly.
as
I
like
don't
like
think that role of banks um, is possible to dismantle. I think the question is the bank a policy-making institution that's sovereign, controlled by a government, accountable to the people, or is it, a cartel of private oligarchical interests? And
hmm
that's really the issue I have with the Federal Reserve. I think we should have a national banking system, um, which is, just like how we have a military and just like how we have, you know, uh, just like the UK has a national healthcare system, just like we have, all these kinds of the post office or whatever. We should
hmm
also have a national bank in that kind of same capacity. And the national bank should be not be a commercial bank. The primary goal should be productive investments into the economy, which raise the overall level of the technology and the material wealth.
Yeah, so I guess my proposal for that, I think the best situation would be if we had a shit ton of small banks, like very small, commercial type banks, where like the traditional type banks we thought, because then they have to think loans in terms of actually like, all right, is this a good loan? Is this person going to pay this back, etc. Because those industries you mentioned, the post office, the Navy, military, they all spend very inefficiently. I mean, the post office is a disaster. The military industrial complex,
Yeah, I mean,
they charge like price gouge the hell out of our Department of Defense, and they pay it.
I agree with you. I think our government's under occupation and nothing really works the way it should. But
So a bunch of small banks. What do you think about that? A bunch of small privately owned banks.
it sounds good on paper, but the problem to me is that the law of competition is that these banks will merge because merging the banks is what makes them more profitable, right? And it makes them more competitive actually. And the goal is actually to eliminate the competition if you're successful, so that you are the bank people have to go to. And this is precisely what the robber barons of the banking system in the early 20th century did. And it wasn't that they needed the government to do this. It was that eventually the government needed them to prop up the economy, just like what JP Morgan did in 1907. So that's what created this kind of power imbalance that allowed them to take over the government. It's not that they needed the government to form the monopolies. It's that
Government
the
helped them form monopolies, though.
yes, yeah, I mean that's fair to say to a limited extent, but the monopolies would have formed regardless. They didn't need the government to form. The logic of economic competition itself makes monopolization and mergers and standardization actually more economically efficient and profitable.
And it offers cheaper prices to people in an ideal, healthy
Yeah,
situation.
and most importantly, it makes incomes and returns, this is the most important thing, more reliable, more predictable. It's that
hmm
predictability that was key, really, and I don't see how that logic could somehow be usurped unless some kind of government policy, like expressly, um, what's the word, preempted it, right? And but I think that would not be like a libertarian thing to do.
Right. Yeah. No, it wouldn't. So I guess closing thoughts here. Would you say that in a perfect situation, if a free market economy was possible, which I know you stated why you don't think it is possible, do you think that'd be a healthy situation? Like if it could actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, like ideally speaking, the wish of Adam Smith and Ricardo and all these kind of people of a free market would be a great thing. I don't think it's very uh, realistic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and so that's where the root of your mindset with the communist stuff comes from, is the fact that you don't have faith in the, I guess, the dynamics of the market to result in that. So you think the lesser of the two evils is the government running it rather than, private entities influencing the government.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair summary of my view.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't think you're insane or anything. I mean, we definitely differ in our opinions. I hold out hope that I think we could strip away some of these powers of the government and monopolies, and work more towards the way of a free market. Because even though we have a ton of flaws, there's a reason that America is the biggest economy in the world and attracts the most capital in the world. And I mean, you choose to live in America, correct?
Well, I mean, I was born and raised
Yeah.
here,
And I
and
mean, you don't, like, you haven't moved to China? Have you ever thought about moving to China?
actually, for political reasons, like in case I get persecuted here, I've thought about it. But I love my country. I love America, and it's not because I think it's better than China or Russia. It's because I'm an American. This
Hmm.
is my country. I went to Moscow just recently. I mean, in terms of the quality of life and the city and the infrastructure, I mean, to be honest, I prefer Moscow. It's not
Interesting.
anything material that makes me prefer to live in America versus Moscow. I would, I would have a very good job, very comfortable, very great life in Moscow, and I prefer it actually. The infrastructure is way better.
Mm.
Um, there's even aspects of the culture I like a lot more. But at the end of the day, I'm not Russian. I'm an
Yeah.
American. It's this country that I choose to be responsible for. It's this history that I choose to be a part of, because it's not just that I was born here. It's that I really fundamentally believe in this country. I don't think there's any country on earth that has been built on the basis of the purport that this one has. That out of all of these conflicting and disparate groups, we can build an e pluribus unum, right? Out of
Hmm.
many, one. We can build one republic, one United States, one America for all the American people, to have all of these people come together and unify on the
Got it.
basis of building a totally new type of civilization. That's where my heart is. That's where my dreams are. And I could probably live better in Russia or China, materially speaking. And I probably wouldn't face as much ostracization and trouble that I do here, preaching a viewpoint and idea that is not very well received. But at the
Hmm.
end of the day, the thing that motivates me is my love for this country. And I do believe in an American dream. And if I was living in Russia or China, every night I would be dreaming of the future that is in store for the history of this country.
Mm. Wow. All right. So, I mean, I think definitely disagreed on a lot less than I was anticipating. But this is a great conversation. I'm glad we had the opportunity to speak.
And me too. And, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. You were a great host, and I had a great
Thanks.
time.
Thank you. So it was nice meeting you. Thank you to everybody for watching. I'm sure we could do this again. Around like big events and stuff. I respect your knowledge of history and economics. Even though we differ in opinion, good conversation. And I'll stay in touch. It's nice
Sure.
meeting
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cool. All right. Bye bye, everybody.
See you. All right. See you later.
See you.